Okay, this is the third video for this week. And I think I'm doing pretty good time-wise. I said that there'll be like 2 to 3 hours of video per week. And so far, I think we're only getting to the 1 hour mark. And that's mostly because you're not here asking me questions and saying, but. So I'm trying to guess them ahead of time and trying to answer them as I'm going through this material. A couple of things to note for the study guide lecture notes thing is that in the last video I said that I would provide on the study guide a couple of links to back up my claim that says there's a lot of science that's fabricated, a lot of scientists that are paid off to say certain things, especially when billions and billions of dollars are at stake. Of course, you're going to pay off scientists to do the research in such a way to give you the kind of results that justify whatever policy you want to make. I added, what happens when you have clean energy bills in Congress. I have a couple of links. And so if you're interested, you can check them out. It's not required, of course, but just to back up a lot of the things that I'm saying so that no one can say I'm just making all this stuff up. One thing that I did forget to talk about in an earlier video is something that I always bring up, but uh, I was in my car one day. This was years ago, uh, listening to the radio, and I heard the DJ disc jockey, right, when there was records to play. But he said that a new scientific study had come out talking about the benefits of drinking coffee, and I drink a huge amount of coffee, so I was like, "Oh, this is really interesting. I'll listen." And I was like, "Oh, okay, wow, I can feel good about myself when I drink coffee." And then the next week, I kid you not, the very next week, listening to the same station, DJ says, "Oh, a new scientific study comes out talking about the benefits of drinking tea." And I said to myself, "Wait a minute, this is weird. I mean, who goes to college, goes into debt because they want to follow a lifelong dream of studying coffee for the rest of their lives? I mean, who does this?" I don't know if any of you guys are science majors, but I'm going to explain to you how this happens. You're a second semester senior, and you didn't think about graduation at all because you were too busy having enjoying your extended childhood and partying all the time, right? And so you're like, "Oh my gosh, what am I going to do when I graduate? I got to get a job." And so you look in the help wanted section of the internet, whether it's Indeed or Monster or whatever, and you're looking at the help wanted ads, and you see this help wanted scientist to study coffee, pay $70,000 a year. You're like, "Oh, that's perfect. Always wanted to study coffee." And so you apply for the job and you get the job. And so now you are a coffee scientist. In other words, what am I saying? All of these scientific studies, they are paid by people to study things, right? The scientists in these studies are paid by corporations, right? $70,000 a year, whatever, to give them information which they want, right? You pay scientists to produce information for you. Who would pay a scientist to study coffee? Coffee companies, obviously. And so I was so curious for this book that I wrote. I looked up that coffee study, and it turns out that the scientists who made this study on coffee work for the Coffee Institute. All right. So who bankrolls the Coffee Institute? Coffee companies. And so all of this whole scientific study thing was a marketing scheme. And so obviously the tea industry heard about this, right? Uh, Still can't get over the Boston Tea Party. And so then they said, "We're going to hire scientists too. And they're going to say things that are going to promote tea." And now we have science. And so science has been made to be something uh, more than what it actually is. In other words, scientists are paid. And if they don't make the information, they don't have the results that they were paid to produce, they're going to get fired. So what do? You have to say the things, your scientific study must say the things that your employers want it to say. Imagine if you're a coffee scientist and after 3 years of study, you say that there are no benefits of drinking coffee. It gives you the jitters, it makes you hungry, you overeat, etc. What do you think happens to that scientific study? What do you think happens to that scientist? You see, and so scientists already know this, and so they don't go through that process of getting fired. Rather, they say, "Oh, dang, I better think of something nice to say about coffee so I can milk this job for all it's worth." Right. And so scientists have to put food on the table. Scientists have families too. They have tuition debt they have to repay. And so they're going to do anything they need to do to keep their job. All right. So that's to sort of put things in perspective. But piggybacking on that, let's talk about um, information, knowledge. Where does it come from? And what's that process called? I call it knowledge production. Probably someone else much smarter than me said it first. So I'll just say it's not original to me. But I call this process of making knowledge production. Okay. In other words, you don't discover facts, right? Like Einstein doesn't discover anything. He produces information to explain what he wants to say, right? It's not like he kicked over a rock and said, "Oh my gosh, I discovered relativity." No, he thought about stuff. And so, how do I explain this? You know what? E equals mc squared. That's the best I can do. So he made this formula. He didn't look in the sky and say, that cloud formation looks like E equals mc squared. What is that? Discovery doesn't happen that way, okay? Or knowledge, Einstein doesn't do. He makes knowledge. Your name, your parents made up your name, right? It's like, oh, what should we call this child? Ah, I know. And whatever logic they use to, uh, you know, determine your name, well, then that's your name, okay? So I don't know, a good buddy of mine, he had a child, and he had a hard time trying to figure out name for the child, and finally he came to a decision, and I was like, dude, where'd you get that name? And he goes, oh, I saw a dog food commercial and the dog had this name. I don't know if he told the child that story, but you understand. So information comes from somewhere and it's produced by someone. Now if you want to explain this process to anyone, you just need one sentence. John sees the girl. So in chapter 3, the knowledge production chapter, you'll see I'm spending a lot of time talking about John seeing and looking at a girl. What's that? John is the subject, right? If you remember your grammar, the subject is John. The verb is, okay, or sees, and girl is the object. The is an article, right? So John, subject, is looking at an object, the girl. And don't go into that objectification thing. This is grammar, okay? Not gender theory, all right? So keep focused now, because I'm going to explain some terms to you. Subjects look at objects, grammatically speaking. The whole university is all about teaching students how to look at things. Supposedly, professors or teachers, instructors know how to look at things correctly. And so you are being trained and you're learning how to not just to look at stuff, but to look at stuff the right way. So therefore your conclusions are the right and correct conclusions. Okay. So you have subjects looking at objects. If you have too much information of the person who's doing the observation, I mean, science, scientific experiments in chemistry class, for example, students are taught how to do the experiment to produce information which everyone else who's ever been in that lab before you for decades, they had the same information too, which always surprises me, because if that's supposed to be science, check this out, right? Do this experiment in exactly the same way that everyone else did, and you must have the same result. That's science, okay? And if you think about it, just think about it a little bit, you realize that it's actually pretty funny. right? That this is supposed to be some kind of truth. This is some kind of information or building block. But basically, to do something in exactly the same way, yeah, you're going to have the same result. And that somehow is supposed to be truth. It's a very interesting proposition. But so science sort of tricks people into thinking that you can be objective, right? I'm going to learn this object, and I'm going to learn this object by following my scientific method to get at this information, right? Which is pretty interesting if you think about it, right? Because really all you're doing is you're training yourself to come with the same conclusions every single time you do it, right? Which is always kind of interesting to me. But really, if you type up your lab report and you say, boy, this experiment was really boring, I had all this other stuff that I needed to do, and what's the point of it, right? You're not supposed to put any of that stuff in your lab report because that would be subjective. You're putting yourself into your objective data reporting. But all we want is objective information. Just report the facts, right? Uh, and that's what we want. And if we only report the facts, we're being objective. But in that process of teaching people how to do science, we have erased the subject, right? You took the subject out of the whole process as if there is no one conducting these experiments. Give you an example of what I mean. Who invented aspirin? Who invented Tylenol? Who invented ibuprofen? Whatever. Who discovered that stuff? No one cares because it just is. It is as if it came out of nothing, like ex nihilo, if you will, right? So there it is. Like no one made it. And we carry on that attitude with pretty much everything else. I don't know if any of you, oh, well, science is required at Temple, right? And so let's just say you register for a science class and they say, you got to buy this book, right? Do any of you ever go to the bookstore and you say, can you tell me something about the author? Do you know which way they lean politically? You know, should I trust this information? It's in a textbook, right? And so if it's a textbook and my teacher assigned it to me, it's got to be true, right? And that's the attitude that most people have. If my teacher said it, it must be true. If my parents said it, it must be true. You know, whatever. You have this assumption that the information has no producer. It doesn't come from anything. It just is. It magically appeared in this textbook, and so I guess it's true. What we have to remember is that all information came from a subject. A person produced that information. In the same way, if I say to you, this piece of paper is red, right? I know more about the person who said that than about the actual piece of paper. I know that the person looking at the piece of paper is standing on that side of the paper. I know that person is probably not colorblind. I know that person probably doesn't like to respect shapes, right? It's all about the color. Uh, and so I know more about the person than I know about the characteristic of the paper, because the paper, I just know it's red. I don't know how big it is. I don't know what shape it is. It's just, I know it's red, right? But that's what I'm trying to get you to understand, that the information that we receive is made by someone. And if you examine that information, you begin to understand the character of the information, the bias of that information, right? What went into the creation of that information. Now, objects, you say, well, how do we become objective? How do we become accurate? You can't, right? Accuracy depends on the criteria, right? What standard you're going to use to determine how accurate you are. Well, that's arbitrary too, right? How accurate you are. Well, I got within an inch, which is okay unless you're dealing with eighths of an inch, right? And then you say, well, accurate to an eighth of an inch. What about a 16th of an inch? You know, and so depending on what criteria you want to use, determines how accurate you might be. And believe me, they're getting into that micrometers, right? So micro level. So there are no facts. I've told you before. Science is extremely problematic. It's all subjective because it's people. Every level of this academic process involves people. Teachers are people, students are people, human error, human bias, human inability to understand perfectly, right? And that's the whole testing process, right? Well, it's kind of falling out of fashion, but nevertheless, I believe in the science, you still have to take tests. And so a test tests, it tries to assess how well you understood stuff, right? And the fact that not everyone gets 100 shows that different people understand things on different levels, uh, right? To different degrees. It's not whether it's a good or bad thing, it's just reality. Okay. So all information is just simply subjective. Depending on your perspective, you're going to see things from your subjective point of view, right? So subjectivity, all we're talking about is the point of view of the person who's talking, of the person who created that information. Now, imagine you say, well, I'm going to try to be objective. The more you try to become objective, uh, I'll say it this way. So when I describe someone, I'll say, I'll describe myself, say, for example, oh, his hair is graying, he wears glasses, he wears t-shirts to lectures. Well, what does that mean? It's like, oh, well, he's just picked out what was obviously visible. No, I talked about the things which were significant to me, right? So I used to have, before I had 4 kids and had 2 jobs, I didn't have any gray hair at all. And as soon as the year I had 2 jobs is the year we had 3 kids, and I went gray like the beginning of the year, the end of the year, completely, right? And so that always kind of bothered me how fast I aged because I was working as much as I did. The fact that so in other words, you're going to pick out the characteristics which mean something to you, and you're going to ignore everything else, right? It's as if it's not even there. And so we subjectively choose based on our value system what is important and what is not. To emphasize even more, and this is really important because what you begin to realize in the news media, your professors, a lot of knowledge producers in science as well, is they cherry pick the information that they need. And I know it, like, how do you know they are? I'm just saying, you have to realize that they, in fact, do that. This is why we need science. This is the way they did their experiment. Let's do the experiment in a different way. Do we get the same result? But that's generally not what people are doing. Anyway, so back in the day, I had to get married. My parents were getting worried because I had no relationships, and they wanted grandkids, etc. So they started introducing, matchmaking stuff, and so they would find uh, they would find and introduce me to people, and usually they were children of their friends. Okay, and so I would meet them, and then and I had an hour to decide if I wanted to pursue this relationship or not. And so anyway, so we did that like 30 times. And then so each time I would come home and my mom would say, well, she would grill me, right, in the typical Asian way. It's like, what do you think? Like, well, but I don't think it's going to go anywhere. And so she's like, are you kidding? Did you see her fingernails? And I'm like, what? I wasn't, honestly, I really wasn't looking at her fingernails, this kind of thing. And so for her, what was significant, what was important to see were physical characteristics that she thought were significant, not necessarily characteristics that I thought would be significant and would be important to have a healthy relationship for the rest of my life. You see what I'm saying? So each of us have a different perspective on what is important and what is not. Each of us have a different way of seeing things. And so what is noticed, what is signified, and what is not is going to be different. And so therefore you get educated, you come to university or school to receive an education which tells you what is important and what is not. Ignore everything else, only this is important, right? And so if you listen to your discussions about racism, about social injustice, they're basically going to tell you this is the only thing that's important, ignore everything else. Well, what is all that else, right? And that's what I'm trying to get you to realize, that the stuff that's being thrown away, ignored, discarded, may change what you think is actually true, right? And so it's all about knowledge production. We produce knowledge, to persuade people, to convince people to agree with us. And this is a highly political adventure. Education is fundamentally political. And so, whether you realize it or not, every single class that you take is trying to persuade you to see things in a certain way. It is insanely political. Now, the thing is, then, in this situation where everyone's throwing all these subjectivities all around, why do people get offended? Right? It's like, oh, I'm triggered, I'm offended, and the boldface word is offended. So, uh, it because it feels like someone is telling you you're wrong, and no one likes to hear they're wrong. Even it stings when I hear. I mean, I'll accept it. I was like, ooh, maybe you're right. All right, and then I have to think about it. And uh, I did a lot of my personal reflection correction first 40 years of my life, and so there's still a lot to work on, but stuff that most other people wouldn't notice. But so every time I hear something, though, uh, I'm unfair or whatever, I take it seriously, and I try to do a lot of introspection and whatever. But most people today, if they hear you're wrong, they get really angry, they get really upset. Understand that in this class, I won't say that you're wrong. I've tried very, very hard never to say, oh, that's wrong. I'm going to try to say, and sometimes I slip up. Going to try to say, you're being subjective. You're insisting that what you see is what I see. You're insisting that this is the only way to see something. That's being subjective, right? And so we have to take care of that this knowledge production process that we engage in doesn't become oppressive. Like, we have to realize, like, if someone says, what do you think? Well, I think it's red. That's what I see too. Now, that's different from saying, oh, I think it's red. Really? You're wrong. So it's this the process. What I'm trying to get you to realize is that education, the process of learning, is that when we hear information that is different from what we already hear, we shouldn't react with being angry. We should say, why? Why'd you say that? What's up with that? Which is a much more helpful, productive, because from there you can say, oh, that's what you saw. This is what I saw, right? This is what I experienced. This is what I know. And if both people in that conversation took this class, then instead of being angry, you would say, oh, I see. You saw it that way. Oh, okay. And so people can move forward. In other words, you can think of options, a different way of going about it that would be better for both of you, instead of being stuck on saying, okay, so what's it going to be? Is it going to be red or light blue for the rest of our lives? Do you have to make that decision? Or can you think of another way of having a conversation where that it doesn't even come up? Right. And this is what I'm trying to get you to understand. So people look at things, they tell other people what they saw. And if you do that in a university, you're a professor. If you do that amongst your friends, amongst your peers, you're someone who has lots of good advice or insight, whatever. So depending on how old you are, the level of education, what school you graduated, what piece of paper you have, that determines basically the character and nature of the information that you're receiving. But really, it's all knowledge production, right? No matter who you are, someone who's trained to see things in a certain way, or someone who's just trying to get their friends to see a movie that they really liked. Information that, let's see, so all information is made. I look at it and then I produce it. I tell other people, you're made that information. I produce that information. This information that has been produced, we call them constructs. Okay. A lot of people mix this up. So this process is knowledge production, but then what is ultimately produced is, we call them constructs. Easy way to remember this, if you're a movie buff and you watch The Matrix, right, the first movie, Morpheus looks over at Neo and says, this is the construct. We make our world. And that's true. Not only did Morpheus say something very postmodern, but we ourselves, we choose what's important in our lives. We choose to see and signify and also ignore uh, things. So the things that we think are important, we remember and we identify them quickly and we say, oh, that's important, got to remember that. And then other things, that's not important, forget about that. We make our world on many different levels, but in the knowledge production sense, we choose what to notice, we choose what to ignore, we choose what is significant, we choose what is not significant, okay? So, but everything that is made are constructed, just like buildings, cars, no, out, cars, buildings, books, even magazines, journal articles, these are all made, they are constructed, okay? So uh, even words, ideas, thoughts, these are all made, all right? And because they have a producer, because they have someone who made them, they are all constructed, okay? So language is constructed just as much as a building is constructed, right? There are rules for construction of language. We call that grammar. Now, what information is the truth? It's not what you think. It's more, well, or maybe some of you already know, it's more about who is paying for the information. Go back to the coffee and tea scientific information. That information was produced because someone paid for it, right? If depending on the funding, that determines the direction of a lot of the information that is produced. Say, for example, you pick up a history book and it's written by the author was a grand wizard of the KKK, a hate organization, total membership 300, something like that. Oh, well, there's a joke about the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, that was it nationally, there's like 300 members and 290 of them are undercover agents for working for the government, right? Who's a Klan member these days? I mean, I don't know. It's kind of weird. I think if there are, it's a very small number of people, and who cares at that point. So what is important, what is significant, we choose to decide. We make this information and we call them constructs. And so funding, so if the Grand Wizard of the KKK wrote the history of the United States, then you would probably be like, well, maybe it's not the most reliable story of the history of the United States. At the very least, you can say, well, that history is very, very subjective, right? And you can't really say true or not true, because to that person who wrote it, it's true to that person, but you don't have to buy into that truth yourself, right? But that's it. So that's subjective. And so you look for a history, a telling of the history that is better. And that search never ends. I just want to emphasize this. The search never ends. And so the more that you can see any information that helps you to see more, understand more, predict more, that information is more reliable and probably better than what you had before. So again, information is subjective. There is no truth, there is only opinion. And to sort of piggyback on that, if you want to say something is true, it is subjectively true to you, but it doesn't necessarily have to be true to anybody else. Everyone has different opinions, everyone has different choices that they will make. So let's look at this. I said in an earlier video that the smallest minority in the United States is the individual. You might be surprised to know that if we were all sitting together in the same classroom and we looked around, no one would be dressed in exactly the same way. The chances of two people walking in dressed exactly in the same way, with the same clothes, same style, same colors, very, very rare. And the reason is because each of us are going to make decisions differently. Okay, even look at cars, automobiles. If I gave each of you $100,000, let's just say I'm the U.S. government, I'm just printing that money, man, and so I give each of you $100,000, and I want you to buy a car with that $100,000, right? And any money that's left over, you can just give back to me. Okay. Well, chances are that even though I've given you these limitations, uh, none of you will buy the same exact car. Even if you buy the same make and model, it won't be the same options package. It won't be the same color. The interior probably has little differences and whatnot. The more you try to make society conform and be alike, like everyone to be the same, the more people are going to try to find ways to express their own individuality. Okay. And so society does not react to conformity. And so this class is not trying to get you all to think in the same way. I'm trying to get you to realize why you are going to make different choices, why you have different values, why you think certain things are more important than other things. And that needs to be protected, because the more, and that's what makes us interesting, right? If we were all the same, I mean, how boring is that? The fact that we are so different makes us interesting, right? And each individual is unique. You are special. There's no, we're not living in a society full of clones, and unfortunately, that's what seems that everyone wants to create, a boring society full of people who think in exactly the same way. No, I'm not down with that at all. I reject that. But we have to recognize that all of this information is coming from certain people's perspective on the way life should be. And it has nothing to do with you. I mean, you might agree with them, but I guarantee 100% of the time you will not make the same choices as that person. I know for a fact no one does what I do. I know for a fact, like, no one does it in the way that I do it. No one does it. And I take, I'm happy about that, right? It makes me unique. It makes me feel special, right? And so even if you think that, or if you think that you're in danger of looking like or mimicking someone else, you make the adjustments so that you're not exactly the same. All right. So in conclusion, information is just observations that people make. And if that information or that tweet or that post gets legs, then it all of a sudden becomes fact. Sort of like the straws in the Pacific Ocean, right? Like if we just ban the plastic straws, you know, I don't know if you guys looked into that, but that came from what I think a junior high or elementary school book report, and not very scientific at all. And so the guy projected, a little student, the young student projected how much waste was going to be produced because of plastic straws, right? And it was just for a school project. And that all of a sudden became scientific fact. And so policy was being passed, and people's lives were turned upside down. And you were like, whose lives were turned? Straw manufacturers, right? People whose whole entire livelihood depended on people using plastic straws. They're out of a job, and you might not care, but those were someone's parents. They were trying to put their kids through college at Temple, you know, whatever, at some university. And so this child's report that he kind of badly wrote, and but he got on the news because it sounded cool, then all of a sudden became scientific fact, which is very, very interesting. Okay, so be aware of where that information comes from, that all information is just simply subjective truth. At the end of the day, you have to decide what you're going to believe, what you're going to rely on in order to make the decisions that you want to make. All right, I'll see you in the next video.